Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. 10 years ago, I wrote an article for the Journal of Creation called Why Was the UK Once Totally Underwater Recently? Marcus got in touch with me a while ago and said, would I give this talk? He has actually translated the article into German, so it's available on the CMI website and via Marcus. There are two questions in there. Why did it happen? Because obviously, if the flood didn't cover my country, the UK, the United Kingdom, then it was not global. So I decided we needed to start somewhere. But of course, the other key question is, did it really happen? This, of course, is the world now. And in the days of Noah, I am proposing that at the peak of the flood, water covered it totally. But obviously, I can only talk about the United Kingdom today. There are a lot of geologists, and I've met, there are a lot of geologists who argue that the flood did not occur. I've got a fairly modern geology textbook by Arthur Holmes and his wife Dorothy, The Principles of Physical Geology. And he tells a little bit of the history of the subject, and he quotes Leonardo da Vinci, who was arguing about whether the fossils are in the rock because of the Noachian deluge or not. And Arthur Holmes argues that he was far in advance of his contemporaries because 300 years had to elapse before the deluge, this flood, ceased to obstruct the progress of geology. Well, I would argue that that's wrong, actually. He goes on in page 30 to talk about James Hutton, who developed the ideas of uniformitarianism. And he says, Hutton had the clarity of sheer genius to realize that the past history must be explained by what we can see happening now. In other words, we push the flood and the idea of the flood completely aside. Now, let's focus on the UK. I've included what I call the Irish landmass on the left. The boundaries between the four parts of the United Kingdom are not precise, but I'm up in the top. You've got Scotland. Down the right-hand side, of course, you've got England with the capital at London. Over on the left, you've got Wales with Cardiff as the centre. And on the very left, you've got the Irish landmass with Belfast as the capital of Northern Ireland. So that's what it looks like today. I've widened the map to include a few small parts of our closest neighbours. On the top at the right, you've got Norway, and then, of course, it moves down to you've got Denmark, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So we can actually talk about that area today, although the focus must be on the UK. Let's take a couple of words from Genesis about the flood. It says two clear things. All high mountains were covered with water, and it says it twice. And all creatures not on the ark that breathe air perished because there was just water. So what we aim to show is that there was no land here during the days of Noah at the peak of the flood. Now, although I've got the outline of the countries on this slide, please don't imagine that that outline was on the seabed, just waiting to come up. The seabed was featureless, with no suggestion that land would soon emerge in the way we see it now. Little bit of theology. Why do people ignore the story? Well, one of two options. Either they want to shut their ideas to the idea that the Bible says we need to obey God, or they have genuine scientific or geological objections. Now, obviously, in this talk, the only thing that I can deal with is the scientific and geological objections. If people want to go with shutting their eyes to God, then the only route for that is prayer. We mentioned Da Vinci, Hutton, not Lyell yet, and the Holmeses. They all did their best to wean people off any idea that there was geology in the Bible. In other words, they were like the ostrich. If you don't like what you see, bury your head and your brains in the sand and ignore it. Well, I believe we can't do that. Go back to land today in 2023. That's what we've got today. Now, geology is restless. Cliffs fall down so that the land is shrinking. In other places, rivers are bringing sediment down, and so parts will expand. And sometimes there's little islands that bob up and down in different places. So what we're going to do is ask these geologists, whether it's Arthur Holmes, James Hutton, or whatever, a modern geologist, what this area looked like 65 million years ago. And this is it. They will admit that the area was mostly water. There are, in the middle, 4 white patches where they think land might have existed. We don't have time really to talk about Norway, which is in the top right-hand corner. But you might say, where are these islands? So I'm going to put the outline of our country back on there. And you'll see that there were 4 islands within the UK 65 million years ago. So we've got a good start. Everything else was covered with water. Number 1 at the bottom there is Snowdonia in Wales, the mountain ranges. 2, 3, and 4 are the Scottish Highlands. Now the question is, why do they say so much of the country was underwater? And remember, these are modern uniformitarian geologists. They're not creationists. The answer lies in chalk. Beautiful picture. I live 15 kilometers from here. The old Harry Rocks at Studland. You can see the Isle of Wight in the distance and the chalk cliffs there. If you've got find the big letter R and just drop down a little bit, you'll see the chalk cliffs. Now, what is chalk? Well, it comes from coccolithospheres. This is a simple model of a coccolithosphere, and these things grow in seawater. They're very small. You need an electron microscope to see them, but they shed those little circular platelets and they drop down to the seabed. So if you see thick chalk with little or no impurities like sand, gravel, shale or whatever, you know that that area has been underwater. The chalk is pure and is produced by seawater. That's the clue to saying that the land has been underwater. Now, of course, Studland was underwater. What about the rest of the country? Studland is on the south coast. If you're ever coming to this country and want to see some of these things, please call on me and I'll take you round. It's a lovely place. Right. There are chalk cliffs at other parts of the UK besides Studland. We've got chalk cliffs on the east coast in Yorkshire, on the right-hand side of the picture. Coming to the south, we've got the south coast, and part of France, of course, shows these same chalk cliffs. Inland, there are a few exposures of the chalk, so we know that the chalk at least is in the bottom part, the southeast of the country. Farming and building and cities do mean that we don't see many inland exposures. But what about the rest of the country? There's a lot up here where we don't see any exposures of chalk. So were they underwater? What we'd love to do is actually pull the country apart. That's that white line. Walk all the way up and see where there's chalk, whether it's under topsoil, other layers. We're looking for chalk. We want to check that we can go all the way from Studland right up into Scotland. I've made up a little imaginary cross-section of what we might see if we could do this walk in this gap, having pulled the country apart. We start on the left at Studland. The colours are yellow for chalk, green for green sand, which exists in quite a lot of places, and orange for gravels and sands. So as we walk up this imaginary channel, we're going to see the chalk exists most of the way. There will be a few places where it's missing, and it's quite clear that it's been washed away. So although there is no chalk in some places, we can infer that it was there once. In a few places where we don't see any evidence of chalk, what do we do? Now, I want to emphasize that this idea of these 4 islands in this country is a conservative view. In other words, some people will say that the whole of the UK was underwater and those islands did not exist. Let me explain how they work that out. On the left here, we have, let's say Mark, and he's standing on chalk. Under the chalk, there's some sand and gravel layers. Deeper still, there's the green sand. He's on chalk, he knows that. But he goes somewhere else, and he's standing on sand and gravel. There's green sand underneath. So apart from the chalk, the 2 sequences of rock are identical. But if the sand and gravel in the left frame in the right frame shows evidence of compression, then it suggests that there was chalk there. And also, if there was chalk there, then the whole sequence was pushed down to a deeper level. The temperatures were different, and you get things like changes to the apatite fission tracts by the higher burial temperatures. So very simply, on the left-hand side, if Mark observes sand, gravel, and green sand, he can infer that there was a layer of chalk there if he's got that additional information that the compression of the sand and gravel beneath actually caused things to change in the rock nature. So we can build up a pretty complete picture of the United Kingdom and show that chalk was all over. So it was therefore flooded. This is the radical view. There are a few arguments which we can deal with a bit later as to whether the inference that chalk was all over there rather than, say, some other material. We can deal with that. But the radical geologists believe that the whole of the UK was underwater 65 million years ago. So, in a sense, we're halfway through it. We have shown that the United Kingdom and near parts of the continent were once fully underwater, and it's the chalk that tells the story. Come and see it for real. I'll take you round. Now we come to part 2. We've got to get the time right, because Noah didn't exist 65 million years ago. Why do the geologists claim that the chalk is so old? We need to show that the date is wrong and that the flood was recent within biblical times. Radiometric dating tells the geologists that the chalk was deposited 65 million years ago. But of course, those geologists, going back to Leonardo da Vinci and James Hutton, believed that the Earth was old before they had any good scientific reason to say why. I do recommend this book. It's not written by me. It's written by Andrew Sibley, Cracking the Darwin Code, Exploring the Non-Scientific Foundations of Deep Time. And it was promoted by Hutton, who was influenced by Hindu beliefs. They believed that the Earth was old even before they had any reason to say why. Radiometric dating is a whole topic on its own. There's these books by ICR. There's a lot of physics in them. We're not going to stop to talk about them, but that is one reason why we can explain that the flood, this idea that the country was underwater 65 million years ago, was not true. I want to focus on a concept easier to understand. We see the impact of the retreat of the flood on our landscape. It's a little valley, a village, a farming community. In the background, you can see the sea. Another one is the Canadian Rockies. How did these situations arise? How did the landscape form? You see, what we haven't talked about is how did land come to be? If the seabed hadn't risen, I wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be here. So we go back to our geologists, our modern geologists, and they say that 65 million years ago, the seabed started to dome in the middle of what is now the Irish Sea, where the arrowhead ends, slowly pushing up the seabed. They believe it's caused by thermal doming, but that isn't important at the moment. So here's a cross-section, a simple cross-section of deep movement in the rocks, pushing up the rock layers, displacing the sea sideways. The sea was probably 200 meters deep, which is quite a lot, and the water would be shed in all directions. Looking at the map, from that point in the Irish Sea, the water would spread to the east, to the west, to the north, and to the south. That's what started the recovery of the land. Now, the water appears to have retreated in two major ways. Firstly, there would have been an element of sheet flow. That's just steady, horizontal, level flow, smoothing much of the seabed. And secondly, there would have been some channelized flow, which I'll explain by pictures in a moment. It would cut gullies and valleys in irregular patterns. And work by Taz Walker and Mike Howard will go into the details of this. This is the effect of sheet flow. This is the beach at Swanage. It's winter, so there's no one around. The dropping of the tide by about 2 meters has caused a very smooth surface apart from a few pebbles. That is the sheet effect of the sheet flow as the flood started to retreat because of the doming, pushing the water slowly aside. Now, if I ask these same geologists what the map looked like 10 million years later, obviously the dome will push up, the dome will increase in size, and it will expand, not perfectly like a circle, but what I've got here is just a simple idea of how much land might have been around at 10 million years, according to these modern geologists. There might have been land in the blue patches. We can't be certain exactly why and what was in there. So, according to these modern geologists, we get this expanding circle of land, and it's actually called a beach. So there is their estimate of land 30 million years after the doming started. The doming is only moving about that much every 10 years, so it's taking a long while to develop land. And of course, that isn't consistent with the Bible. Let's stop the story at 35 million years after doming started. And remember, all this detail comes from secular modern geologists. We've got a huge area of beach, not perfect beach. It hasn't moved completely as a circle. We've got a huge area of beach-like rock down here in Devon and Cornwall. And that is because some doming started here as well. Although the main doming started up in the top, it did also later appear and start in other places. So we've got land where we've got brown. We're not sure quite how much land was here, but there are reasons why we've now got sea. And you've got what you call a delta lagoonal complex of mud and bits of broken rock down in the southeast of the country. And out of interest, in France over here, the doming started further to the southeast, and the land actually moved like that, creating what is now the English Channel or the La Manche. Right, that deals with sheet flow. What about this a more aggressive channelized flow? This is a picture of a small river in Bude, which is in Cornwall, at low tide. At high tide, the water came up to where the grass is. The tide went down, creating this almost plainer surface like a beach, except it's very, very muddy. But because the ground is quite saturated with water, and we've got rain as well, we've got a small trickle of water coming in this channel. And this is a channel that develops after that first sheet flow. So we've got two stages. We've got the sheet flow, and then we've got the more developed channelized flow. If we go back to our picture of the beach at 35 million years, supposedly after the land started to emerge up here, the geologists have identified a number of major rivers. They're named after some of our own modern rivers, the Trent and the Thames. Their courses wiggled around, they were sinuous, they've moved quite considerably, but they can follow these because of the gravel that is brought down. But I want to focus on this one down at the bottom, the proto-Solent. That did not flow from this area downwards for two reasons. First of all, there was, of course, additional doming in this area of Cornwall and Devon, but there was a lot of ridging in the geology along here, which stopped the river from developing southwards or in any other direction. Let's look at it now. Sorry, this is its path. It was so aggressive that it eroded the section between the bulk of the United Kingdom and this little island here, the Isle of Wight. So it was quite an aggressive river, as were things like the Thames and the Trent. The geologists say that these rivers were Amazonian in size, nothing like they are today. And when you think about the size of the Amazon River, then you realize a lot of water was moving down those rivers. This is the midsection of what used to be the Proto-Solent. It's now just a small river called the Frome in the middle of a wide and deep alluvial valley. The chalk ridge, which I mentioned, is there. You can't see the chalk unless you actually scrape away some of the grass, but it is a very strong chalk ridge that kept the river flowing from the right to the left. But all you've got is this little small river here. Close up of the River Frome at Wool. It's 10 meters wide, 1 meter deep. It flows at 7 cumecs. That might be a unit that you're not familiar with. That's a cubic meter of water per second. So the river is flowing at about walking pace, not a lot of water. When you compare it with supposedly a river Amazonian size actually flowed across here. Little cross section perhaps gives a better idea. You've got the chalk bowl shaped because of folding. There's gravel brought down from Devon and Cornwall, and the little river is wiggling its way across the water meadow. This valley points to a water flow not of 7 cumecs, which is what happens today, but over 100,000 cumecs. The river ends in Poole Harbour. This is all that's left of this mighty Proto-Solent river, a rapidly silting harbour, 5 kilometres wide and about 60 metres deep. It was coming across here. You can see the width of it in full. I'd love to go in an aeroplane and actually get some better photographs, but that's for another day. The Thames is 10 times as big as our Frome, but is still nowhere near an Amazon river. Danube is getting closer, 6,500 cumecs, but still a long way from what the Proto-Solent was. Now, the key question is, what sustained these Amazonian-sized rivers flowing at 100,000 cumecs or more? There's only two choices. It rained as much in 1 hour as we get in a year, or that doming that brought the land out took place not at a millimetre a year, but several meters a day. Thus, the floodwater, which was typically 200 meters deep, cleared quickly, leaving only rainwater to fill the deeply eroded channels. Now, which is your choice? That one sounds impossible, for it to rain as much each hour as we get in a year, that the land would just be a mud bank. So we have to say that the doming took place at a rate of several meters per day. That's the point at which the land is rising to recover us from Noah's flood. Let me give you a couple of other examples of where you can find evidence of a huge river, several rivers, in fact, in the countryside and in the towns. This is an example from Dumpton Hill. We've got the town of Honiton, which is Devon, over on the left-hand side. Now, what do you see apart from fields and a few houses? You've got on the left-hand side a planar surface from sheet flow. On the right-hand side, you've got another planar surface from sheet flow. And you've got a wide valley. Now, if I stretch the picture upwards, you can see these features clearer. Same picture, but stretched. On the left, you've got the planar surface. It doesn't look completely flat, and that's because the trees are growing at different heights. On the right, you've got the same planar surface, although the trees there are at irregular heights. And in the middle, you've got a sinuous valley that's heading towards the sea. And there's no water in there. So what eroded that valley? It was the rapid rise of land shedding the water at the end of Noah's flood. You can see different types of valleys. I've given you an example from the countryside. You will see them in built-up areas. This is a built-up area in part of Parkstone. Again, forget the cars, forget the houses. What do you see? Flat plateau in the distance caused by sheet flow. And behind me, when I took the photograph, there is another flat plateau. But here in the middle, you've got an extensive valley. No water down the bottom there. It is not due to folding. It was due to erosion. If I go to the left at the bottom, then I find that the valley gets narrower until it reaches almost the plateau. If I go to the right, then the valley gets wider and deeper until it eventually meets the sea. The fact that there's no water there and the shape of it tell us that a lot of water left that area very, very quickly. Now, the key point is really the geologists are saying that it took 35 million years for these events to happen, but they haven't asked the question, where did the water come from that sustained these Amazonian-sized rivers, which they talk about? Where did the water come from that created this extensive valley? And the answer has to be that after the Noah's flood had reached its peak, the water went down very quickly, not in millions of years. Now, I can't put an exact date on this, but we have taken away many millions of years from the story that the UK was once underwater. So just to summarize, in the early part one, we have shown that the whole of the UK was once totally underwater. And the evidence comes from geologists who don't like the Bible, but cannot ignore the story of chalk. And then the second part is that all this happened very recently, not 65 million years ago, as the geologists want to assert, because they don't stop to think about landscape. but I want to encourage you to do so. So when you're next outdoors, look for these valleys. Look to see whether there's anything like a small river in there, and realize that that is an indicator that the flood dropped very, very quickly, not from millions of years ago. And here's a challenge. I've done this for the United Kingdom. Can you, and I'm happy to help, repeat this exercise for Germany and other countries? I've already given you a hint that France may be easy to handle, but wouldn't it be very interesting for others to come forward and say, I'll have a go with my country? Thank you.